Welcome back, fellow Broadway lovers. On this episode of the Boxy Babes podcast, we're going to continue our discussion of the Broadway revival of Gypsy. However, returning from the story and characters to the musical and technical side of the show. But before we jump into it, please like, follow, and subscribe here on YouTube and all other social media platforms at Boxy Babes. Thank you again for joining us and enjoy the show. So before we jump into the other aspects that we didn't get time to talk about in our last episode, we're just going to give you a brief rundown of our last episode. So we broke down the story of Gypsy, who was a real-life burlesque dancer, Gypsy Rose Lee, and the relationship with her mother and her sister. However, on this episode, we're going to be turning towards the stars and technicality of the show. Thank you again, sir, for being here. It's always a pleasure to have my fellow Boxy Babe on here with me. We talked about the story, very old-fashioned, very classic Broadway. And now we're going to go to the music, which is also quintessential classic Broadway. What did you feel about the music of Gypsy?
It's infamous, right? I mean, as soon as the 10-minute overture started, I was like, oh, I know the majority of this music, having never seen a production of it ever. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, but also love a lot of the songs from it in their very playful. I would describe a lot of the music as playful, just also due to the premise of the show. But and then you have your power ballads that everybody has sung at an audition at least once in their life.
I do want to start with the overture because I feel like classic shows have not only the overture, but you have what it's called, the re-entree. Is that what it's called? The beginning of the second act, which is kind of like an overture, but it's like welcoming you back.
The entr'acte.
Okay, and then you also have like that finale orchestra number. Like these, like you're bookmarked in and out of these shows. It's kind of like giving you the extra time to get into your seats, get down, get situated. The lights are kind of coming down low. And this show had all three of those. It was like letting you know this is Broadway. This is the big deal. And you're right. Like the overture is 10 minutes long. You're sitting there and they're playing pretty much the music to all of the big songs from the show. And you kind of sit there and you're like, oh, I think we even turned to each other a few times. And we're like, oh, I recognize that song. I know that song. But you do feel that the old feel to it.
Yeah. And it is interesting that if you notice, the house is not quiet during that time. Mm-hmm. Truly, people did not shut up until the lights were completely dark and the stage curtain went up. Which is just interesting to me because for someone who maybe is super interested in the instrumental part of a production, that is like the bread and butter of the show. Like that is the gold. And so I would be interested, it would be interesting to go back to when this show, was first launched and see how audiences behaved during those times. Because same thing with the entr'acte for Act 2, it was more like a cue to go sit back down than actually a part of the show.
I would agree with that. I feel like a few shows that we saw, like the lights would flicker, or like they would do like the ding ding ding, like they would do some kind of letting you know. But this one was kind of like the music swelling, kind of get back to your seats. And people didn't really go back to their seats right away, or like there were still people waiting for bathroom or waiting for drinks. And so it's interesting because it was kind of like we're giving you time, but that was never a feeling that I've ever had with a Broadway show before. Like, to me, it's always the music plays, you're sitting in your seat, the lights are dimming low, but like the lights weren't even dimming yet. They were still quite bright as this music was kind of going on.
Yeah, and that is for sure a show decision. Mm-hmm. I've seen shows really based on the production do it both ways, where you literally, like Wicked is a good example. They have a very long first hold, what we call it in in the Usher world, there's
For
a
sure.
10-minute hold at the top of Act One. And even though the first like 3 minutes are just percussion and instrumental, and yeah, there's a couple things happening on stage, but really it's mostly music. Um, no one is allowed to even open a door into the theater. And so, and meanwhile, you have other shows that just continue to seat um, people through an overture, which is a little bit shocking to me. Maybe it's based on the age of the production. Maybe it's based
Sure.
on what they deem important and not important. But every show is a little bit different.
I think also it's the way it was set up too was a little bit when you like look at the theater, like because I'm thinking like we saw Sunset Boulevard on this trip, which we'll talk about at a later date, and it had like a 20-minute hold because it's absolutely pitch dark and it has to be black in there and the doors close. But I don't remember the doors closing to the theater of Gypsy. It kind of opened up to the backlighting of like where everything was, like the bathrooms and stuff, which felt like a I don't know, it felt like a different type of theater, which led to this like more classic feel. Because there wasn't a hold, there wasn't nothing. There was the show was happening, whether you wanted to like whether you were there or not. It was kind of going on, but I even think back to when Les Mis came here, and like there was the doors closed, and there's an overture for nearly as long, and you sit there and you're expected to sit there and to take it in and be part of the experience. And this felt more like a kind of reminding me of like carnival music in a way of kind of being like literally let us entertain you, but in a way that's like kind of like we're all in this very jovial moment together without feeling overwhelmed by the events of what's going on. That was a long-winded answer. But for this show, we also have, like you said, in the last episode, we have the ballads, we have the fast songs. I'm always kind of drawn to songs like "May We Entertain You" because it's kind of cutesy and nice, and that song has its own progression through the show as we get to "Let Me Entertain You" at the end of Act 2, which is a lot different than the "May We Entertain You" at the beginning of Act 1. But what music do you feel like, while you're sitting there, you haven't really seen this show before, you know some of the music, what songs were you like drawn to throughout this production?
Well, coming in, I knew "Let Me Entertain You," of course, and "If Mama Was Married," and those are the two that lyrically are earworms for me. So they just like I was very familiar, but and I'm of course blanking on the titles right now. But there are a few others, and of course, I mean, Rose's Turn is just a quintessential.
That's
I
Broadway,
mean,
baby.
I don't think anybody breathed during that song. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, because of the delivery to Audra is just she is a star, and so she
Yes.
delivered like a star. But uh, all of that to say, I actually don't think that I've ever performed singly a song from the show because I wasn't ever super drawn to any of them. Um,
Okay, that's fair.
but, but yeah, but I appreciated many of them.
I think the one, like, obviously, we both chose to kind of go to the show for Audra McDonald. Like, this was kind of like, again, we were going there to see all these shows, but like, we chose Gypsy because Audra McDonald is she's a star. She is like the Broadway star, like the Dina Menzel's, the Kristen Chenoweth, like the ones that like when you think of Broadway, she comes to mind. And so getting to see her sing, like everything's coming up roses, the end of Act 1, was this magical moment. And seeing her sing Rose's Turn in my head, I was like, there's no way that she doesn't win for Best Actress for a Tony Award, because she gave her all in these songs, and she became this role so it was like such a vivid portrayal of Rose that I couldn't think of anybody else who had ever performed it before. Like, I know that like Bernadette Peters has played the role before and stuff like that, and like I could not think of a single person who had been on the stage before and played this role, because she made it such her own. And so those songs, again, I wasn't singing them when I left, but those were definitely the ones that I thought about as I'm sitting down, as I'm talking about people like, oh, you saw Gypsy, how was it? I'm thinking of Rose's turn. I'm thinking of Everything's Coming Up Roses, because they're those heavy duty ballads that she killed.
Yeah, and I mean, and I won't go super deep into this, but I do think it is a point to say that like this was the first, from what I've read, intentional casting in regards to having women of color portray these roles together. And I do think that it changes the role. I think it changes the character, because of when we're looking at the time frame in which this would have been occurring, when we're looking at the things that needed to be overcome just by being who, like any woman, but then a person of color, just adding hardship to hardship. And so there was just a genuine type of, it was like an ache that I think the whole room, of course, felt, but it truly was, yeah, it was next level. Because I think, yeah, many people can sing that song, and yes, it's a powerhouse song. You're going to do well, but to get a standing ovation mid-show for an elongated time, it was not short.
Not at all.
For one song, rightfully so. Rightfully so. Just, yeah, heart and soul. Even when we kind of portraying, as we talked about in episode 1, a little bit of villainry, a little bit of the bad guy, and yet was the bad guy, and yet you felt all of the heartstrings for her.
I'm really glad you brought that up about the intentional change to the story to feature a woman of color, a women of color, because having watched the original show, the original movie, it's a very white portrayal story, which again, you're on vaudeville in the 1920s. It's still, you're a woman who's pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is not, and you're a single mom at that, and you're doing the best for your daughters. Like, there's all these things that you can do, and then you add the extra layer of being a woman of color. And when she sings of the pain in Rose's song, you could feel all the different layers of pain that there was, and all the reasons why she was crying. It wasn't just because she lost her daughters. That was a big reason, but there was also the stuck in a world that doesn't like you because you're a woman and because you're a black woman, and like all of these different things. And I was even tearing up at that point, and you're right. People were giving her a standing ovation, and they actually had to start moving the show on after she stood there for quite a long time, tears streaming down her face. And that felt special, and that felt magical, and that spoke to the power of making such a change like that. And I think that it was a genius change.
Yeah, and I am just so glad that Broadway seems to at least be moving in a direction where that's something that we're no longer hung up on. And maybe that's, obviously I'm not on Broadway. I'm not in the meetings behind the curtain, but seemingly, comparatively to many other media platforms, I think we're a little bit more progressive thinking in regards to just like, if this person can authentically play this role, then we're gonna have them do that. Period.
I think back to, I'm not going to name names, but I'm going to talk about a play from a few years ago with Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, where they talked about, there was a big controversy with Hermione when they cast an African American woman in the role, and the idea was that like there was nothing quintessentially about the person that the color of their skin mattered. I think that was a very important thing, because there's nothing about, other than the fact some may argue that like we're basing this on real people, but there's nothing about the story that Sondheim like is telling here, or the songs, that you can't be any woman of color. It was more important that you're a mom with daughters and you have that dynamic and you have that on stage. It doesn't matter what you look like to play that role, as long as you're talented and you're telling the story, like that is there. Like that's not tied to, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think when I was reading up on some of the decisions, because I also didn't want to misspeak, it was interesting, both the casual, the way in which it was spoken about was just so natural and casual and just made sense, while also being clearly intentional. Like it was a choice, it was a decision that was actively made. But yeah, more of that. Would love to see more of that.
Absolutely. Speaking of changes too, when I was kind of looking it up, the ending, which we didn't talk about in episode 1, but I wanted to bring up, is the ending of the show has changed from like production. Like sometimes this is not a happy ending. Like where we got it, Rose and Louise are kind of embracing and they walk together and you kind of get this reconciliation. There's some times where it's not left up to that, or it's left up to interpretation, which I thought was an interesting change too, because I think it explains to, again, that journey that we talked about in episode 1 of those two characters, of Rose and the growth that she had and where she's coming from. And again, Audra McDonald just really sells that. Was there anything musically about the show that didn't hit for you? I will be honest, and I'm so sorry for the people who absolutely love Gypsy. There was a lot of this musical numbers and stuff that again felt very dated. I think this speaks to the time period of the show, where it does feel a little it feels like it's aged a little bit. It feels like it, compared to a lot of the other shows that we saw, it was again that classic feel, and you have to be going for that classic feel to really enjoy it. But there were some of the musical numbers that I was just like, I could take it or leave it.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially maybe some of the length of them. After like 3 or 4 minutes, I was like, all right, I'm good. We're good.
Yes.
And obviously, like, again, like some of them just aren't memorable. Like you just, you got through it and it played into the story and that was it.
I mean, I'm going to argue, and again, I guess this is me just being devil's advocate here, but there's most of Act 1 that is forgettable. There's most of Act 1, which is interesting because I'm usually a big Act 1 lover. For some reason, I think Act 1s are just incredible, and sometimes Act 2s usually will lose me. But this was one that I thought that like it had a tighter musical like story in Act 2 than Act 1. And I don't know if it's because there was actually more dialogue in Act 2 to kind of carry the story a little bit more than Act 1 did, because I mean, I'm looking at it, there's like 4 or 5 extra songs in Act 1 compared to Act 2. So I just think that's interesting to note.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of setup in Act 1. But it felt very redundant. Like, yes, you're pushing your kid. How many more times can you push your kid before they walk away? Got it. Same thing with kid number 2, which is basically Act 2, except very quickly happens, right? Like, we only get a couple scenes rather than a whole act. We get like a scene for Louise, that the push and pull happens, and then we move on.
Yep.
And I think we just lose. To me, Act 1 is like We did all this setup with June, and then she just walks away, and that entire thing almost feels like you lost out on, I don't even know. I mean, you just lost so much story. And once again, having never seen it before, and truly not knowing who Gypsy was, I was like, who is Gypsy, right? Like, like I see June, Louise, and Rose. There's no Gypsy in this show, obviously until Act 2. And so...
And deep in Act 2 as well.
Yeah, so for the first act, when June walks out, I'm like, what is the rest of the play? What do you mean? Because you spent an hour and a half being like, here's June. And now she's gone.
Which in the film, and if somebody has recently watched the film, I know I need to probably watch the film, please comment in the comments and let me know, but I feel like there was not as much emphasis on Baby June in the film as there was on Gypsy Rose. And I feel like most of the film was Act 2. I feel like they're like, Let Me Entertain You in Act 1 was like a huge montage of a lot of things that happened in Act 1 for the film. So I think that is interesting too, because there is it's a huge emphasis on Baby June for her story to end up nowhere. And I feel like sometimes, as I should say all the time, as audience members, we need catharsis, we need a release, we need some form of resolution, and that story is very much left in the balance of just being like, well, here it is, she didn't come back, she's gone, let's focus on something else. And I feel like you do feel like you're missing that part, you're missing that piece of that story.
Yeah, once again, putting the movie on my watch it list, because I'm intrigued.
I do want to say, though, along with obviously Audra McDonald's performance, stellar, perfect, should win for Best Actress, I do want to put Joy Wood up there too, though. Not maybe, like, I'm not saying like put her up there for Best Actress, but I think that she gave a really good performance, especially late in Act 2, when she goes from young girl to burlesque dancer, and you see that confidence within the course of a song, within the course of a scene, and then like the absolute like stellar performance that you get between the two of them as they're finally confronting each other. That was part of what made this show so that part was spectacular to me. That was like the shining point of the show and that leads into Rose's song, but I do think that Joy Woods did kill this performance at the end. Like in Act 2, really just she shined.
Well, yeah, and truthfully, I mean, obviously I knew that she was in this show, and all through Act 1, I was like, what is the draw for an actress to this role? I mean, obviously you're the title, but because she had minimal to do in Act 1. And so obviously it was a much happier in Act 2 when we actually get to see some character and some development. And really, yeah, once she is succeeding in the burlesque world is when we even actually get to see her really do anything. And be, the character development of being outside of the timid little girl that we've basically been seeing for, an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes.
I completely agree. At first I was so confused because, like, having just come off The Notebook, granted I know it closed, but she was one of the stars of The Notebook, and it's like, what drew you to Gypsy other than like you're gonna be in Gypsy? Like, what was like at the end of Act 1, we're in intermission, we're standing up, we're stretching, and I was like, what drew her to this role? Because it doesn't feel like you're getting anything. There's like nothing there. Acting wise, you're kind of behind the scenes. She's the cow's butt for a good chunk of Act 1. Like, what is that draw? And then when you get to Act 2, you really get to see that. Was there anybody else's performance that stuck out to you? I feel like there was a lot of little parts. I feel like this was one of those shows that there was like 2 or 3 big parts, and then everything else was like a lot of filling in the gaps.
Yeah, and I mean, and that is always the case when you have a show that has a title above the title, right? When it has a name above the title, you know who you're coming to see. Doesn't matter, doesn't matter if you're a fan of them or not. If I'm buying tickets to Audra McDonald's Gypsy, guess what I'm
Right.
seeing? Audra.
Right. No
So,
understudies. No.
well, yeah. Um, or at least that is the primary motivator, I think, for many folks. Of course, if you love the show, then you're going to go see it regardless. But um, it makes sense to me that that is the way that it's titled, because 80 to 85% of the show is Rose.
Absolutely. I mean, as we kind of discussed in part one, that this is very much, she's the narrative connection. So it makes sense to have somebody big like her, like Audra McDonald, in the role. And again, that's what drew us there. And I'm sure that's what drew many people who love Broadway, who love theater. They went there to see her. Before we wrap up, obviously, I want to touch on the sets and the wardrobe. Minimally, there was not much to these sets. They felt very much like that old school Broadway feel, which we kind of, again, talked about in that first episode of being like, you're there for the person, you're there for the story, you're not there for the sets. But was there anything about the set that did jump out to you, or about the costumes? I do have to say, I thought it was pretty cool, the car and how they had it come in and come out, and like it clearly looked like kind of like a cartoony driving car in and out, but it also had a very realistic feel. So I thought that was a really cool little bit. And that's what stuck out to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think period costumes always are so important to get right, which I do think that, for the socioeconomical class that they were trying to portray, and essentially being on the run, right? Like, chances are they had not too many clothes, as was stated. They were mostly sewing together their own costumes, and that's what they were traveling with. And so the costumes, I think, were fun. And then, of course, the burlesque costuming, I think, is always a comedic point of the show, especially the one that was lighting up.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. So I mean, I just always shout out to the wardrobe folks, because, man, they help create the costumes, and then literally are standing in the wings for literally anything to go wrong. Obviously, you always hope that nothing does, but man, I don't think I've been in a show that something hasn't ripped or torn or not come off or whatever, especially when you have massive headpieces like they were having, and all, of course, like the wigs. I'm sure every single person had at least one or two. So it's a lot, but nothing particularly super showy that might have been like, oh wow, that's super impressive. Just like appropriately so.
Right.
Yeah.
It gave the focus to the stars still without distracting it. And I actually forgot about the light up burlesque costume. There was a few of those pieces that were, again, they felt like appropriate for the show, where they were like flashy within the setting of it, but not flashy in like again, I think of like Death Becomes Her, when we have those like sparkly dresses and everything. And like, there's nothing that was just like catching your attention necessarily, maybe besides Gypsy's red dress towards the end, which is like nothing but sparkles, and that really did kind of seal the deal of her being a burlesque dancer. But yeah, so it felt like everything felt very appropriate for the show. And like we do with every production that we see, what is the rewatchability of this? Would you go see it again?
If not for Audra, I am not so sure. I think it is a classic. I'm glad that I saw it. I was obviously incredibly impressed with everything that happens, but the plot and the story and the show itself just seemed to move slow for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, much like I'm sure many folks in that theater, for the star power, I would come see it again, but probably not for any other aspect of it.
Something that we had kind of mentioned as we were leaving the show is, I wonder how long this lasts without someone's name like Audra McDonald on it. Because I feel, again, this is one of those shows, kind of like a Merrily We Roll Along, where a lot of people went to go see it because of the power within the show, and maybe enjoyed it along the way. But this is a very like the power heavy. We're going for the person, maybe not necessarily for the show. And so I do wonder what happens when she leaves the show, and if it continues without her, or if they get another big star to take her place. But if it wasn't for Audra, I probably, like, if I was going with somebody else and they wanted to see it and it had somebody like Audra in it, I would probably say yes. I might try to find something else to go see if it's not someone like Audra McDonald in the role. So I guess it's a toss-up. I guess it's leaning more towards no, but you never know what the world brings you. And once again, we are running out of time, so thank you for joining us on the second part of our Gypsy discussion. Stay tuned as we break down more shows from Broadway and here locally in Michigan on future episodes of The Cosmic Curtain. Thanks again for joining us in our box seats till our next curtain call.